All right, so let's go to resource. And we can see that we have a web app. Let me scroll down a little bit. There's no data here yet, but we do have a URL, and we chose this URL. So if I was to copy this URL or to click on it, it should open a website. That's going to give me a default page that tells me that it's working. So I'm going to click it. The web app takes a second to start up, and then we can say, hey, .NET Core, your app service is up and running. So this is sort of a default page. There's no code that's been deployed, but this is sort of default page saying, now we need to deploy something here. So that to me is a successful web app running right now. So let's tab back to the portal. Now, because this is a web app, we can stop it, restart it. I'll talk about the swapping in a second, but we should be able to see here, we just visited the web page, and so 400 bytes of data left the Azure. We can see our one request. So we're the only one who's been to this website. Now, like I said, one of the great things about the web apps are how integrated it is into deployment environments. And so you can set up what is called continuous integration or continuous deployment if you have your Git code stored in Azure repos, GitHub, Bitbucket, or even a local Git environment. Every time you commit new code into your Git repository, that could trigger a publish into Azure. So you will, every time code has been finally committed, you've got a brand new updated website. And that's one way to work in a development setting, is just to have your development environment always reflecting the latest committed code. You can also do an FTP push. We do have FTP credentials, and some environments like Eclipse, and I think even Visual Studio supports an FTP deployment, but that's not required. Visual Studio has built-in connections to Azure for deployments. Now, let's look at the configuration tab. Now, this is going to be very familiar to you. If you're all familiar with IIS, the Microsoft Web Server running on versions of Windows, you're going to have a lot of this same configuration. So application settings are basically variables that you can set that have a value per application. This is like the web.config file that has app settings inside of it. You can also have connection strings. And so keeping out of the code your database connection strings, you can have that deployed in your portal. And that's available to the app, but it's not sitting in the code. So there's some security to that. Again, we've chosen .NET Core 3.1. We can go in here and actually change to 2.1 or to latest or etc. We've got our authority over different versioning. If we allow FTP deployment, it's allowed, or FTPS only or disabled, always on. So there is a cold start problem. If you don't visit this web app after some period of time, Azure's going to shut it down in order to save resources. Now, it tries to start it up very quickly, but it does take a few seconds to go from being unstarted to being started, and you can turn this always on. There's a session infinity, so if you've got state stored in session variables, you do not want users to be flipping between different instances of the web app, you can force session affinity. This is .NET Core on Linux, but if we're running like a Windows .NET, we can do remote debugging. So right within Visual Studio, we could step through the code line by line with running inside of Azure, require certificates. We can see this, again, very similar to IIS settings to me. I mentioned we can set up custom domains. We can force HTTPS only. So if we don't want people visiting this in an unsecure manner, we can set that. So SSL has a certificate that's been created for this. We can attach this to a virtual network. This is one of the more recent things with app services. It used to be that you couldn't attach an app service to a virtual network. Now, if we want to control traffic to the app service for only internal users, turn off and disable the public link, we could put that into Vina integration. Azure Front Door service is relatively new. It's a load balancing that works on a global scale, etc., etc. That's the overview for now. In the next video, we're going to talk about scaling web apps.